Have you ever noticed how a man can walk away looking calm, unfazed, even cold, while inside something is slowly breaking? Here's the truth. Most people never tell you. Men don't stop feeling. They just stop showing. And that silence, it's not emptiness. It's emotional pressure building up behind walls. They were taught to never let fall. From a young age, men learn one powerful rule: control your emotions or lose respect. So instead of expressing pain, longing, or regret, they bury it. They distract themselves. They stay busy. They convince themselves they're fine. But the heart doesn't forget just because the mouth stays quiet. What really happens is this. When a man loses a woman who made him feel understood, accepted, and emotionally safe, his emotions don't disappear. They go underground. And that's where they grow stronger. Late at night, in quiet moments, when distractions fade, that's when missing you hits hardest. This video isn't about making a man weak. It's about understanding the emotional reality he hides from the world. Because when you understand why men suppress their deepest feelings, you'll finally understand what truly makes a man cry missing you, often when no one is watching. It doesn't happen all at once. There is no dramatic scene, no instant collapse. The moment he realizes you're truly gone arrives quietly, almost deceptively. At first, he tells himself nothing has changed. He still has his routine, his distractions, his pride. He assumes time will smooth things over, like it always does. But then something small interrupts that illusion. It might be a message he instinctively reaches for, only to remember there's no one to send it to anymore. Or a moment when he wants to share a thought, a joke, a frustration, and realizes the one person who used to understand instantly is no longer there. That's when the absence becomes real. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. What hits him hardest isn't losing the relationship. It's losing the emotional access, the safety, the feeling of being seen without having to explain himself. He starts noticing the spaces you used to fill without effort. The way you softened his edges, grounded his chaos, or made ordinary moments feel familiar and alive. And here's the part he doesn't expect. Pride stops protecting him. The ego that once told him he'd be fine begins to crack. Because being alone feels different when it's no longer a choice. When silence isn't peaceful, but empty. When distractions stop working, that's when it sinks in. You didn't just leave his life, you left a permanent emotional imprint. And in that realization, something shifts. He understands that what's gone can't be replaced, only missed. When emotional loss hits a man, it doesn't move the way people expect it to. It doesn't rush to the surface or demand expression. Instead, it travels inward. His mind immediately shifts into control mode, trying to organize pain into something manageable. Logic becomes a shield. He tells himself reasons, explanations, timelines, anything that turns emotion into something he can analyze rather than feel. At first, detachment feels like strength. Staying busy feels productive. Avoiding the ache feels smart. Male psychology is wired to fix problems, not sit inside them. So loss is treated like a challenge to overcome rather than a feeling to process. He distracts himself with work, noise, routines, or even new connections, not because he doesn't care, but because caring feels like losing control. But emotional loss doesn't respond to strategy. It waits, it slips through cracks in the schedule, and shows up when the mind is tired. That's when memories resurface without warning. Not the bad ones, but the small, intimate moments that carried meaning. The tone of your voice, the way you understood him without questions. These memories bypass logic and go straight to the emotional center he thought he'd locked away. Over time, the mind stops fighting and starts reflecting. Regret forms not from dramatic mistakes, but from subtle realizations, things he took for granted, moments he didn't protect, feelings he didn't express. Male psychology processes loss slowly, but deeply. And once it reaches that stage, the pain isn't loud, it's heavy, personal, and impossible to outsource. That's when missing you stops being a thought and becomes a feeling he carries everywhere. Silence does something words never can. When you stop explaining, stop reacting, stop reaching out, it removes the emotional feedback he was used to measuring himself against. Words give him something to push back on, something to justify, something to dismiss or debate. Silence leaves nothing to argue with. And that's exactly why it lands so deeply. At first he may misread it as indifference. He might even feel a brief sense of control, telling himself you've accepted the situation or moved on. But silence doesn't stay neutral for long. It creates a vacuum, and the mind hates empty space. Without your voice, your reactions, your emotional presence, his thoughts rush in to fill the gap. That's when questions start forming on their own. Is she really done? Did I misjudge how much I meant to her? Why isn't she trying anymore? Silence forces reflection, because there's no external signal to lean on. It removes reassurance and replaces it with uncertainty, which is far more unsettling. What makes silence powerful is that it shifts the emotional labor back onto him. When you were speaking, explaining, or expressing hurt, he could unconsciously assign responsibility to you. Your silence takes that option away. Now he has to sit with his own thoughts, his own choices, his own role in the ending, and that's uncomfortable. Silence also disrupts expectation. He was used to knowing how you would respond, what you would say, how you would feel. When that predictability disappears, the emotional connection doesn't vanish, it echoes. The absence of your presence becomes louder than any argument ever was. Over time, silence reframes value, not because you are trying to prove anything, but because your emotional energy is no longer available on demand. And that loss of access is what lingers. It's not punishment, it's consequence. And that's why silence doesn't just get his attention. It stays with him long after the words would have faded. The memories that haunt him aren't the dramatic ones. They aren't the fights, the endings, or the last conversation. What replay in his mind are the moments he never realized were becoming permanent. The ordinary ones, the quiet familiarity. The way you fit into his life so naturally that he stopped noticing how rare it was. They show up without warning. A song playing in the background of a random day. A place he passes without thinking. A smell, a phrase, a certain time of night. Suddenly he's back in a moment where everything felt simple and connected. And that's what makes it hurt. Those memories don't come with tension or conflict. They come with warmth, safety, belonging. His mind replays how you listened without trying to fix him. How you understood what he meant even when he didn't say it clearly. How your presence softened parts of him he didn't even know were guarded. These memories don't accuse him outright, but they quietly ask a question he can't escape. Why did I let this go? What makes these moments haunting is that they contrast so sharply with the present. He notices the silence where your voice used to be. The lack of depth in conversations that once felt effortless. The emotional comfort that hasn't been replaced, no matter how busy or surrounded he is. And the worst part is that memory is selective. It doesn't replay the ending. It replays the meaning. It highlights what was real, not what went wrong. That's why these memories linger longer at night, when distractions fade and honesty surfaces. In those moments, missing you isn't about regret alone. It's about realizing that something irreplaceable existed, and that he didn't recognize its value until it became a memory instead of a reality. What men wish they had said doesn't live in long speeches or dramatic confessions. It lives in the quiet sentences they rehearsed in their head and never released. The simple truths that felt too risky to say out loud. The feelings they assumed you already knew, or worse, believed would make them look weak. Many men grow up learning that timing matters more than honesty. They wait for the right moment to speak, not realizing that moment rarely announces itself. So they hold back appreciation thinking there will be more time. They delay vulnerability, assuming strength means staying composed. By the time they realize words were needed, silence has already done the damage. What they wish they had said is often painfully basic. I didn't know how to show you how much you mattered. I was scared of needing you. I thought you'd always be there. These aren't excuses, they're admissions. But admitting them would have required stepping out from behind pride, and pride felt safer than exposure. Men also wish they had explained themselves better, not to justify their actions but to be understood. Many conflicts weren't about lack of love, but lack of communication. He may have wanted to say, I'm overwhelmed or I don't know how to handle this, but instead he chose distance, assuming space would solve what honesty could have healed. After you're gone, those unsaid words don't disappear. They echo. They replay in moments of reflection when the emotional noise quiets and clarity finally arrives. That's when he understands that silence wasn't maturity, it was avoidance, and avoidance has consequences. What hurts most is realizing that saying those words now wouldn't change anything. The opportunity passed with the relationship, and that awareness creates a specific kind of regret, the regret of knowing the truth existed, but never had the courage to give it a voice. Regret doesn't come from the breakup itself. It forms later, triggered by moments he didn't expect to carry weight. At first, he feels relief, distance, even a sense of freedom, but emotional triggers don't announce themselves. They slip in quietly, attached to everyday experiences that suddenly feel incomplete. One trigger is contrast. He meets new people, has new conversations, and realizes something is missing. Not excitement, not attraction, but depth. The ease he once felt, the emotional shorthand you shared isn't there. And comparison begins without his permission. Not because he wants to look back, but because his nervous system remembers what felt safe and real. Another trigger is growth. When he starts improving his life, emotionally, mentally, or even practically, regret can intensify. Because growth brings clarity. He begins to see the ways he could have shown up better, listened more carefully, protected the connection instead of assuming it would survive anything. Progress reveals missed chances. Loneliness is also a powerful trigger, especially when surrounded by people. It's in social settings where laughter feels shallow or conversations feel transactional. That's when he realizes you weren't just a partner, you were his emotional home. And losing that kind of connection doesn't register immediately. It sinks in slowly. Then there are moments of vulnerability, when something goes wrong or something good happens and instinctively he wants to tell you. That impulse alone can unlock regret. Because it reveals that emotionally you were his first point of contact. These triggers don't attack him all at once. They accumulate, and eventually regret isn't about missing the relationship. It's about recognizing the role he played in losing something meaningful. That's when regret becomes personal, not abstract. And once it settles in, it's hard to silence. Independence changes the way you exist in his memory. When you don't collapse, chase, or beg to be understood, it disrupts the story he expected to tell himself. He may have assumed you would always be emotionally available, always waiting, always willing to adjust. Independence quietly proves otherwise, and that realization lingers. What makes independence unforgettable is that it removes entitlement. Your life continues. Your energy redirects. Your identity doesn't shrink around the loss. And that forces him to confront a truth he didn't want to face. You didn't need him to survive. You chose him to share your life. That distinction hits hard once the choice is gone. Independence also reframes your value. When you stop centering your world around his reactions, your absence becomes more noticeable, not because you're trying to be distant, but because your presence was never dependent. You added to his life. You weren't filling a void. And once that addition disappears, the loss feels sharper. There's also something unsettling about watching someone you once had emotional access to become unreachable. Not out of bitterness, but self-respect. Independence signals emotional strength. It says you felt deeply, but you also knew when to step away. That balance is rare, and rarity is what memory clings to. Over time, he realizes independence wasn't coldness. It was clarity. You knew who you were without the relationship, and that meant loving you was never about control. It was about alignment. Losing someone like that doesn't create drama. It creates reflection. And reflection is what makes you unforgettable. Because independence leaves him with no illusion to hide behind. No story where you were weak or replaceable. Just the quiet understanding that someone strong enough to walk away with dignity is also someone strong enough to be deeply missed. There's a subtle moment when missing someone stops being a quiet ache and turns into sharp, relentless pain. At first, it's manageable. A thought here, a memory there, fleeting pangs that can be distracted by work, friends, or routine. But slowly, those moments start stacking. They accumulate, layering on top of each other, until the emptiness isn't background noise anymore. It's the main story. The breaking point comes when he realizes that no distraction, no rationalization, no casual interaction can replace what he lost. He begins noticing the void in his daily life, the laughter that doesn't feel complete, the silence that feels heavier. the absence of someone who understood him without needing explanations. Missing you transforms from thought into feeling. It's no longer something he can rationalize away or compartmentalize. It's often triggered by simple things. A song on the radio, a shared joke with someone else, a place you once frequented together. These moments crack the armor of indifference he built around himself. Pride, denial, and distraction crumble, and the emotion he tried to bury surfaces with a force that can't be ignored. That's when the missing stops being nostalgic and starts being painful. It hits in his chest, in his sleep, in the way he notices life feels less full without you. The pain isn't just about loss, it's about regret. The things left unsaid, the moments taken for granted, the chances to show love that went unused. It's a deep internal reckoning with what he failed to protect, what he failed to appreciate. And unlike the initial ache of missing someone, this pain doesn't fade easily. It lingers, surfaces unexpectedly, and forces him to confront the truth he spent so long avoiding, that some losses aren't temporary, and some people aren't replaceable. By the time he reaches this breaking point, the realization is clear. Missing you has evolved into understanding the weight of what's gone, and the consequences of not valuing it when it was still in his hands. It's a quiet, inescapable kind of pain, and it leaves a mark that won't fade quickly. Emotional absence is far more powerful than physical absence. When someone is gone physically, it's easy to rationalize. They're busy, they're away, they'll return. But when your presence, your attention, and your emotional energy are no longer available, it creates a vacuum that no distraction can fill. That emptiness forces reflection in ways that proximity never could. For a man, this absence is confusing at first. He may think it's temporary, that it's a phase, or that you'll reach out soon. But over time, the lack of emotional connection becomes undeniable. He notices the small things he took for granted. How you understood his moods without explanation, how your reactions felt validating, how your support made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. Those gaps aren't loud, but they are relentless. They whisper constantly, reminding him that something essential is missing. Emotional absence works like gravity. It draws attention inward, forcing him to confront the void he once ignored. He begins to replay memories, analyze interactions, and question decisions. What he once dismissed as normal routine or daily companionship now becomes the highlight of what he's lost. Each memory is intensified by contrast, the vibrant connection he once had versus the emptiness he now feels. Longing develops because absence creates perspective. The comfort, understanding, and attention that were always there before are suddenly gone, and he begins to recognize their true value. He starts noticing how no one else meets that standard, how no one else provides the same emotional resonance. What was once easy and taken for granted becomes rare and unattainable, and that realization fuels desire and reflection. Emotional absence doesn't manipulate, it teaches. It highlights what was real and meaningful, and it forces him to acknowledge it in a way constant presence never could. Over time, that absence is no longer just noticed. It's felt deeply. It creates a persistent, underlying longing that penetrates even when he tries to distract himself. And that longing, once fully recognized, is unforgettable. It lingers far beyond words, reminders, or temporary connection. Becoming impossible to forget isn't about drama, games, or manipulation. It's about presence and impact. Emotional, psychological, and subtle. It's the way your energy lingers even after you leave. The way memories of you resurface uninvited. The way your absence feels heavier than your presence ever did. People rarely forget what truly shaped their emotions, and when you leave a lasting mark, it's impossible to erase. It starts with authenticity. When you live in alignment with who you are, express your feelings with honesty, and maintain your values without compromise, you create a sense of clarity that people remember. Men in particular notice when someone isn't performing or pretending. They remember the way you made them feel, understood, seen, and valued, not through words alone, but through consistent presence, respect, and emotional resonance. That consistency creates a subconscious imprint that stays long after the relationship ends. Independence is another key. When you value yourself enough to live fully without relying on validation from him, you demonstrate strength and self-respect. That combination of emotional depth and independence is rare, and rarity is memorable. He doesn't just miss your presence, He misses the standard you set, the balance you embodied, and the space you once filled effortlessly. Finally, the emotional legacy you leave matters. It's the way you handled connection, the small gestures, the moments that felt ordinary but were actually extraordinary to him. When he reflects later, it's not about the mistakes or the endings. It's about the person you were and the way you made him feel alive in ways no one else did. To become impossible to forget isn't about forcing someone to feel. It's about living fully, loving honestly, and maintaining your presence so that even in absence, your influence lingers, shaping memories, stirring longing, and creating a mark that time cannot erase.